put your phone or device aside and immerse yourself in this audio story. Perfect for listening on the move, while relaxing, or for bedtime listening. We release new stories daily, so make sure to like and subscribe to not miss out. This story is based on true events. The fortress that opened from within. They called it the fortress, the impenetrable vault where digital gold slept behind walls of encryption, protected by billion-dollar security systems that promised absolute safety. Coinbase, the name synonymous with trust in an industry built on shadows and pseudonyms. But in the summer of 2025, 70,000 people discovered that the fortress had a back door, and someone had left it wide open. This is the story of how the world's most trusted crypto exchange became ground zero for one of the darkest data breaches in financial history. A breach that didn't come from hackers in hooded sweatshirts, but from something far more chilling: the company's own legal defense. Welcome to the dark side of business, where your personal information becomes collateral damage in corporate warfare, and the platforms promising to protect your wealth can't even protect your name. The fortress was never as secure as they claimed. In the world of cryptocurrency, trust is currency. It's the invisible asset more valuable than Bitcoin, more essential than blockchain technology itself. Without trust, the entire ecosystem collapses into the digital void from which it emerged. Coinbase understood this from day one. Founded in 2012 by Brian Armstrong and Fred Ehrsam, the San Francisco-based exchange positioned itself as the antithesis of crypto's Wild West reputation. While competitors operated from jurisdictional gray zones, Coinbase wore compliance like armor. They courted regulators. They implemented know-your-customer protocols that would make traditional banks jealous. They went public on the Nasdaq in 2021 with a valuation exceeding $85 billion, a coronation that seemed to validate their approach. The message was clear. Coinbase wasn't just another crypto platform. It was the grown-up in the room, the bridge between the anarchist dreams of decentralization and the structured reality of regulated finance. But every fortress has foundations, and Coinbase's were built on something more fragile than code: human data. Millions of users had surrendered their most sensitive information to create accounts: social security numbers, driver's licenses, passport scans, facial recognition biometrics, financial records, transaction histories, the kind of information that, in the wrong hands, could unravel lives. The exchange promised military-grade security, cold storage for digital assets, insurance for deposits. They assured users that their personal information lived in encrypted vaults, accessible only through protocols so secure they bordered on paranoid. For years, people believed them. 70 million users worldwide entrusted Coinbase with both their money and their identities. A leap of faith in an industry where trust is as volatile as the markets themselves. Then came the class action lawsuit. Like most corporate disasters, it started small. A legal dispute that seemed routine in an industry drowning in litigation. Users claimed Coinbase had failed to adequately protect their accounts from unauthorized access, that the exchange's security measures fell short of the promises made in sleek marketing campaigns. The lawsuit wound through the courts, accumulating plaintiffs the way a snowball gathers mass downhill. Standard corporate legal theater. But in May 2025, Coinbase's legal team made a decision that would transform a manageable legal problem into a privacy catastrophe. They filed a motion with the court. Embedded in that filing, attached as exhibits and supporting documentation, were the personal details of approximately 70,000 users: names, addresses, email accounts, transaction histories, account identifiers, the kind of granular personal data that transforms anonymous crypto users into flesh and blood targets. And here's where the story takes its first dark turn. These documents weren't sealed. They were filed in public court records, accessible to anyone with an internet connection and a Pacer account. The fortress hadn't been breached by sophisticated hackers employing zero-day exploits. It had been unlocked from the inside by lawyers who apparently forgot that court filings are public documents. For weeks, the data sat there in plain sight, a loaded gun on a public table, waiting for someone to notice. When privacy researchers finally discovered the exposure, the reaction was immediate and visceral. 70,000 people, many of whom had chosen cryptocurrency specifically for its promise of financial privacy, suddenly found their identities splashed across public records, their participation in the class action lawsuit, now a matter of permanent public record, their personal details available to anyone curious enough to look. The irony was almost poetic. People who had sued Coinbase for inadequate security protection just had their privacy destroyed by Coinbase's own legal defense. But this is where the business thriller truly begins, because data breaches are never just about the data. They're about what happens next, in the shadows where exposed information becomes currency. The cryptocurrency world operates in a moral gray zone that traditional finance watches with equal parts fascination and horror. It's an ecosystem where billions of dollars flow through pseudonymous wallets, where fortunes are made and lost in algorithmic seconds, where the promise of decentralization collides constantly with the reality of centralized power. Exchanges like Coinbase sit at the unstable center of this contradiction. They're centralized institutions enabling decentralized finance, regulated entities facilitating unregulated speculation, corporate structures built on anti-corporate ideology. This tension creates unique vulnerabilities, and the 2025 data breach exposed one that few had considered. What happens when the custodians of crypto privacy accidentally become the destroyers of it? The exposed data painted a comprehensive picture of the plaintiffs' financial lives. Transaction histories revealed trading patterns, investment strategies, wealth levels. Email addresses became gateways to phishing campaigns. Physical addresses transformed anonymous crypto traders into targetable individuals. In crypto circles, this kind of exposure carries risks beyond identity theft. It makes people marks for physical robbery, extortion, kidnapping. The industry had seen it before. Wealthy crypto holders targeted in brutal home invasions, forced at gunpoint to transfer digital assets that exist beyond the protection of traditional banking security. Now, 70,000 people who had merely joined a lawsuit found themselves potentially exposed to this underworld. Security experts immediately recognized the catastrophic scope. This wasn't a traditional hack where stolen data might be sold on dark web markets to faceless criminals. This was worse. This was verified, court-stamped, publicly accessible information with the imprimatur of legal legitimacy. Scammers could craft phishing emails with surgical precision, using real names, real transaction details, real account information to create perfect social engineering attacks. The data didn't need to be laundered through criminal marketplaces. It was sitting in government servers, freely accessible, permanent. Coinbase's initial response followed the standard corporate crisis playbook. Express concern, promise investigation, announce enhanced security measures. But the statement felt hollow to those whose data was already in the wild. You can't unbreach a breach. You can't recall information once it's been published in permanent court records. The company offered identity protection services, the same band-aid solution every major corporation extends after catastrophic data exposures, as if credit monitoring can erase the fundamental violation of having your financial life made public without consent. Behind closed doors, the legal implications were metastasizing. The people who had sued Coinbase for inadequate security now had an entirely new legal claim. The company's own lawyers had exposed their private information through apparent negligence. New lawsuits began filing almost immediately, transforming what had been a discrete legal dispute into a multi-front war. Class action attorneys, smelling blood, circled with new filings, alleging privacy violations, negligent handling of sensitive data, failure to protect plaintiff information. Each new legal action created more public records, more filings, more potential exposure. A recursive nightmare where the act of seeking legal remedy potentially created additional privacy breaches. But here's what the headlines missed: the dark detail buried in the technical analysis. This wasn't the first time Coinbase had exposed user data through legal filings. Privacy researchers digging through court records discovered previous cases where similar information had been filed publicly, though at smaller scales. The 70,000 user exposure wasn't an isolated mistake. It was part of a pattern, a systematic failure in how the company's legal department handled sensitive user information in litigation, which raised a chilling question. How many other court cases contained similar exposures that simply hadn't been discovered yet? How many users who had never joined a lawsuit, who had never even considered legal action, might find their information sitting in public records because of tangential mentions in other cases? The breach everyone knew about might be just the visible tip of a much deeper privacy catastrophe. This revelation transformed the narrative from simple negligence to something darker: systemic indifference to user privacy hiding behind a facade of security theater. The cryptocurrency industry has always existed in the uncomfortable space between privacy advocacy and regulatory compliance. Bitcoin emerged from the ashes of the 2008 financial crisis, a digital middle finger to centralized banking institutions that had gambled away the global economy. Its pseudonymous design promised financial privacy in an age of increasing surveillance capitalism. But as crypto matured from anarchist dream to trillion-dollar asset class, that privacy promise collided violently with regulatory reality. Governments demanded exchanges implement anti-money laundering protocols, know-your-customer verification, transaction monitoring that would make intelligence agencies proud. Exchanges like Coinbase became data honeypots, collecting detailed personal information on millions of users in the name of compliance. The business model itself contained a fundamental contradiction. Promise users the privacy of decentralized finance, while collecting centralized databases of their identities. This tension had always existed beneath the surface, papered over by assurances of robust security and careful data handling. The 2025 breach ripped away that paper, exposing the raw contradiction underneath. Users had surrendered privacy to gain access to privacy-focused technology. And now, that surrendered privacy was being casually exposed through legal incompetence. The fallout rippled through the broader crypto ecosystem with seismic force. Competitors seized the opportunity to differentiate themselves, announcing enhanced privacy protections, minimal data collection policies, sealed court filing procedures. But the industry veterans knew the truth. Every major exchange faced the same impossible balance. Regulatory compliance demanded data collection. Legal defense demanded evidence production. The moment you became large enough to matter, you became large enough to be sued, and lawsuits meant court filings, and court filings meant potential exposure. Coinbase's breach wasn't an outlier. It was a preview of systemic vulnerability built into the architecture of regulated crypto platforms. Security researchers began reverse engineering the exposure, trying to understand the precise failures that led to such catastrophic data leakage. What they discovered painted a picture of institutional carelessness that bordered on criminal negligence. The legal team had apparently failed to redact sensitive information before filing. They hadn't requested the court-sealed documents containing user data. They appeared to have treated user privacy as an afterthought in the heat of litigation strategy. prioritizing legal defense over the privacy protections users had been promised. Internal emails that later leaked suggested some team members had raised concerns about the public filing, only to be overruled by senior attorneys focused on meeting court deadlines. If true, it meant the breach wasn't even an accident. It was a conscious choice to prioritize legal convenience over user protection. The exposed users faced immediate and lasting consequences. Within weeks of the discovery, security firms detected massive spikes in targeted phishing campaigns using information from the court documents. Emails arrived with specific transaction details, account balances, trading histories, information that could only have come from the leaked filings. The scams were sophisticated, referencing actual legal proceedings, mimicking Coinbase's communication style, exploiting the very real fear that victims' accounts had been compromised. Some users reported suspicious activity at their physical addresses, strangers appearing at homes, vehicles conducting surveillance, the kind of real-world stalking that transforms digital exposure into physical threat. The crypto community's worst fears were materializing. Exposed wealth, attracting dangerous attention in the physical world. But the psychological damage ran deeper than fraud prevention could address. These were people who had chosen cryptocurrency partially for its promise of financial privacy, who had carefully guarded their trading activities, who had never posted about their investments on social media. Now their financial lives were permanently enshrined in public court records, searchable by name, linked forever to their participation in the class action. Future employers could find it. Neighbors could discover it. Family members they'd never told about their crypto holdings could stumble across it. The privacy loss was irreversible, the exposure permanent, the violation complete. Regulatory agencies began circling, sensing blood in the water. The SEC, already hostile to crypto's resistance to traditional oversight, saw ammunition for broader enforcement actions. State attorneys general launched investigations into privacy violations, consumer protection failures, negligent data handling. European regulators, armed with GDPR's strict data protection requirements, started examining whether Coinbase's European operations had violated privacy laws that carry penalties reaching hundreds of millions of dollars. Each investigation created additional legal exposure, additional discovery demands, additional opportunities for more information to leak into public records. A doom spiral of litigation, begetting exposure, begetting litigation. Then investigators discovered something that transformed the entire narrative from incompetence to something potentially darker. Coinbase had been warned. Internal documents revealed that privacy officers had flagged concerns about legal filing procedures years earlier, recommending systematic reviews of all court submissions to prevent exactly this kind of exposure. Those recommendations had been documented, circulated to senior management, and apparently ignored. Budget requests for additional privacy-compliant staff had been denied. Proposals for automated redaction systems had been shelved. The company had made a calculated business decision. The cost of robust privacy protection in legal proceedings wasn't worth the investment. They had run the numbers and decided that potential legal exposure from privacy breaches was acceptable compared to the expense of preventing them. 70,000 users weren't victims of an accident. They were victims of a business decision, collateral damage in a spreadsheet calculation that valued efficiency over privacy. This revelation detonated whatever remaining trust existed between Coinbase and its user base. Users could forgive mistakes. They couldn't forgive deliberate indifference. The business implications extended far beyond Coinbase's immediate crisis. The breach exposed a fundamental flaw in how the crypto industry approached user privacy. It was performative rather than structural. Platforms invested billions in securing digital assets, cold storage, multi-signature wallets, hardware security modules, bug bounty programs. But they treated user data privacy as a compliance checkbox, a legal requirement to be minimally satisfied rather than a core business imperative. The sophisticated encryption protecting Bitcoin holdings coexisted with cavalier handling of the personal information, identifying who owned those holdings. It was security theater at its most dangerous. Impressive technical defenses, masking catastrophic organizational failures. Venture capitalists who had poured billions into crypto infrastructure began quietly reassessing their portfolios. The breach demonstrated that regulatory risk extended beyond securities law and market manipulation. Data privacy violations could trigger existential legal liability that no amount of technological innovation could protect against. Boards of directors at competing exchanges convened emergency meetings, ordering immediate audits of legal filing procedures, panicking about what might be lurking in their own court records. Insurance companies offering cyber liability coverage for crypto platforms dramatically increased premiums or withdrew coverage entirely, recognizing that the industry's structural privacy vulnerabilities made catastrophic exposures inevitable. The human cost manifested in ways that transcended financial damage. Users reported anxiety, paranoia, fundamental loss of trust, not just in Coinbase, but in the entire premise of centralized crypto platforms. Some abandoned cryptocurrency entirely, liquidating positions and returning to traditional banking despite its flaws, deciding that known surveillance was preferable to unknown exposure. Others migrated to decentralized exchanges and self-custody solutions, accepting massive inconvenience and security risks to escape centralized platforms they could no longer trust. Support groups formed online, where exposed users shared security strategies, compared notes on suspicious activity, commiserated about the psychological burden of permanent privacy loss. They were refugees from a breach that could never be undone, trying to rebuild security in a world where their financial activities were now permanently public. Legal experts began drawing comparisons to history's largest data breaches, Equifax, Target, Yahoo, but recognized crucial differences that made Coinbase's exposure potentially more damaging. Traditional breaches involved stolen data traded in criminal underground markets, giving victims at least theoretical hope that the information might remain contained within criminal networks, with economic incentives to limit distribution. Coinbase's data wasn't stolen. It was published with legal authority, stamped with court seals, hosted on government servers with preservation requirements, ensuring it would exist in perpetuity. There was no criminal network to disrupt, no dark web markets to shut down, no stolen databases to trace and potentially recover. The breach was permanent, official, and entirely legal. Congressional attention followed inevitably, with the kind of predictable outrage that follows any high-profile corporate failure. Hearings were scheduled, strongly worded letters were sent, regulatory reforms were promised. But industry observers recognized the fundamental challenge. Existing privacy law hadn't evolved to address the unique vulnerabilities created by cryptocurrency platforms. Traditional financial privacy protections assumed centralized institutions with established regulatory frameworks and government oversight. Crypto existed in regulatory gray zones, operating under patchwork state and federal rules that frequently contradicted each other. The question wasn't whether Coinbase had broken existing privacy laws. It was whether existing privacy laws were adequate to govern an industry operating on the edge of legal frameworks designed for different financial systems. Brian Armstrong, Coinbase's CEO, maintained studied silence as the crisis unfolded, a sharp departure from his typically vocal presence on social media and in crypto circles. When he finally addressed the breach in a blog post, the language was carefully lawyered, expressing regret while avoiding admissions of fault that might strengthen legal claims. He emphasized the company's commitment to security, announced new privacy protection initiatives, promised reforms that critics noted should have been implemented years earlier, when internal privacy officers had first raised concerns. The statement satisfied no one. Exposed users saw it as too little too late. Investors worried it admitted too much liability. Regulators viewed it as evidence of institutional failures requiring enforcement action. Behind the corporate communications, a darker calculation was taking place. Coinbase's legal team was assessing potential liability exposure, class action damages, regulatory fines, individual lawsuits from users whose privacy breaches led to concrete harms. The numbers were staggering, potentially reaching billions of dollars if every exposed user recovered maximum damages under state privacy laws. Settlement negotiations began almost immediately, with plaintiffs' attorneys demanding astronomical figures, while Coinbase countered with arguments about limited actual damages given that no financial assets were stolen. It was the familiar dance of litigation arithmetic. Lawyers on both sides calculating expected values and settlement ranges, while the actual victims waited to learn what their destroyed privacy was worth in dollar terms. The crypto community's reaction fractured along predictable ideological lines. Decentralization maximalists seized the breach as validation of their core thesis. Centralized platforms inevitably betray the privacy promises that attracted users in the first place. They argued for radical self-custody, peer-to-peer exchanges, technology solutions that eliminated trusted intermediaries entirely. Pragmatists countered that mass crypto adoption required user-friendly centralized platforms, that regulatory compliance demanded data collection, that perfect privacy was incompatible with mainstream financial integration. The debate had existed since Bitcoin's Genesis block, but the Coinbase breach gave both sides fresh ammunition, hardening existing positions rather than fostering productive dialogue about balancing privacy and accessibility. Technical researchers began developing tools specifically designed to help users assess their exposure from the breach. Dark web monitoring services offered free scans to check if information from the court filings had migrated to criminal marketplaces. Privacy-focused crypto projects launched awareness campaigns, using the breach to promote privacy-preserving alternatives to centralized exchanges. Cybersecurity firms reported surges in demand for personal security consultations from crypto holders terrified about physical safety risks from wealth exposure. An entire cottage industry emerged around breach remediation, companies offering services that ranged from legitimate security consulting to borderline scams, exploiting victims' fear and confusion. The breach's timing couldn't have been worse for Coinbase's broader business objectives. The company had been lobbying aggressively for clearer crypto regulations, positioning itself as the responsible industry leader that regulators could trust to self-govern. That narrative collapsed under the weight of 70,000 exposed users and evidence of ignored internal privacy warnings. Regulatory conversations that had been progressing toward potential frameworks favorable to compliant exchanges suddenly stalled as lawmakers questioned whether any crypto platform could be trusted with user data. Coinbase's competitors, smelling opportunity, pivoted their own regulatory lobbying to emphasize robust privacy protection, using the breach to differentiate themselves even as they quietly scrambled to audit their own legal filing procedures. International implications rippled outward as foreign regulators examined whether similar exposures had occurred in their jurisdictions. The European Union, already skeptical of American tech companies' data handling practices, launched investigations into Coinbase's European operations under GDPR provisions that treat privacy violations with near-criminal severity. Asian markets, where crypto adoption had accelerated despite regulatory crackdowns, saw renewed calls for domestic-only exchanges that could be governed entirely under local privacy laws. The breach accelerated fragmentation in the global crypto ecosystem, pushing markets toward regional platforms rather than the borderless financial network that early crypto advocates had envisioned. Employees inside Coinbase faced their own crisis of conscience. Engineers who had joined the company believing in its mission of financial empowerment through technology found themselves defending an organization that had carelessly destroyed user privacy. Privacy officers whose warnings had been ignored faced difficult decisions about whether to go public with evidence of institutional failures. Knowing whistleblowing could end their careers, but remaining silent made them complicit. Some resigned, posting cryptic LinkedIn updates about pursuing opportunities more aligned with my values. Others stayed and fought internally, organizing employee pressure campaigns, demanding meaningful reforms rather than cosmetic public relations responses. The company's internal culture fractured between true believers still convinced in the mission and disillusioned veterans who had seen too many compromises and ignored too many warnings. As months passed and the initial shock faded, a grimmer reality settled over the exposed users. There would be no real resolution. Legal settlements might eventually deliver modest financial compensation. Identity monitoring services would be extended for years. Security recommendations would be issued and probably ignored. But the fundamental violation, the permanent public exposure of private financial information, could never be remedied. The data existed in court archives that would outlive everyone involved, searchable and accessible, a permanent record of financial activities that users had never intended to publicize. Some moved, changing addresses to create distance from the exposed information. Others changed names, undertook elaborate identity protection measures, effectively went into witness protection from their own financial past. A few simply accepted the exposure and tried to move forward, learning to live with the knowledge that their privacy was gone and would never return. The broader crypto industry absorbed the lessons it wanted to learn while ignoring inconvenient truths. Exchanges announced enhanced privacy protocols, but few committed the resources necessary for meaningful change. Regulatory discussions included privacy protection language, but implementation was left deliberately vague. Users were offered more consent forms, longer privacy policies, additional checkboxes to click. The illusion of enhanced protection without the expensive structural changes that actual protection would require. The pattern was depressingly familiar to anyone who had watched corporate responses to previous data breaches. Just enough visible action to satisfy public outrage. Not enough real change to prevent the next catastrophe. What made the Coinbase breach particularly chilling was how preventable it had been. This wasn't sophisticated state-sponsored hacking, wasn't zero-day exploits or social engineering or insider threats. It was administrative negligence, institutional carelessness, the mundane evil of ignored warnings and declined budget requests, and decisions that prioritized convenience over protection. The breach proved that sometimes the darkest business stories aren't about criminal masterminds or complex frauds. They're about ordinary institutional failures, the slow-motion catastrophes that result when organizations stop caring about the people they're supposed to protect. 70,000 users learned a brutal lesson about the crypto industry's core contradiction. Platforms built on technology, promising privacy, collected centralized databases of personal information that became single points of catastrophic failure. They learned that security promises are only as strong as the least careful employee, that privacy protections are only as robust as the smallest budget allocation, that trust once destroyed cannot be rebuilt with press releases and settlement checks. And somewhere in the court archives, hosted on government servers, protected by data retention policies ensuring permanent preservation, the personal information of 70,000 people sits waiting, available to anyone with curiosity and a Pacer account, a permanent testament to the price of institutional negligence in an industry that promised revolution but delivered familiar failures in digital clothing. The fortress was never as secure as they claimed. The walls weren't breached from outside. They were opened from within by people who knew better but chose differently, in service of legal strategies that treated user privacy as expendable collateral in corporate warfare. This is what happens when trust becomes currency, and companies decide that currency isn't worth protecting. This is the dark side of business, where your personal information, your identity, your financial life, your carefully guarded privacy becomes just another line item in a legal filing, another exhibit in a court case, another data point in a public record that will outlive us all. The breach is permanent. The exposure is forever. And 70,000 people learned that in the crypto world, the greatest threat to your privacy isn't hackers in hooded sweatshirts. It's the platforms you trusted to protect you, making decisions that prioritize everything except the promises that convinced you to trust them in the first place. Welcome to the dark side of business, where the fortress was never real, and the walls that promised protection were always just for show. Subscribe and listen to our next story below.